court. Like there's been some influence there, right? So like Ralph's dad being a commander in the Navy, that has created influence. Piggy being raised by his auntie and like having a dad who died and a mother who seems to be like absent. That's affected the way that he is. And at the very end, we learn that they've been, you know, in this, I mean, we know it from the beginning that they've been in war, but at the very end, we actually get those like images of war, that there's this like, in fact, everyone go there with me on page 200. So the very first image we get of adult life re-entering society, it says he staggered to his feet, tensed for more terrors, and looked up at a huge peaked cap. It was a white-topped cap, and above the green shade of the peak was a crown, an anchor, gold foliage. He saw white drill, epaulets, a revolver, a row of gilt buttons down the front of a uniform. A naval officer stood on the sand, looking down at Ralph in wary astonishment. On the beach behind him was a cutter. Like a big ship. Her bows hauled up and held by 2 ratings. In the stern sheets, another rating held a submachine gun. So with the revolver and the submachine gun and the ship that is a warship, he's saying like, look, society has been violent. Now, William Golding again is saying this is because human nature is violent, and that produces this violent society that will always, you know, go to war with each other no matter how good our government is. But couldn't it be that these boys are influenced by the society that they've been in? They have war on the brain, and that this is what causes them potentially to act out in their setting. And I think that then the book becomes more complicated than William Golding himself gives it credit for being, that the answers aren't just so clear cut that we can say, yeah, strip away all of society and this is what we're like. It could be, there's no way to strip away society to tell what we're all like, you know, it's more complicated than that. So Freud actually has a similar view to Golding, and I wanted to talk about what his sort of idea is about our psyches. So you may know Freud from his popular work, The Oedipal Complex. Have you ever heard of an Oedipus complex? Well, that's probably good. That's more of something maybe you'll encounter in college, but you also, if you take this AP psychology class, you'll hear about it. Oedipal complex is that really uncomfortable theory that little boys are in love with their mothers and hate their fathers because they're jealous of their fathers. And he kind of later in his career, he talked about the Electra complex too, which works the same way. Little girls are in love with their fathers and want to have jealousies with their mothers. And Freud kind of got a bad rap because that's the thing, that's actually not the most salacious thing from Freud. He's got all sorts of crazy ideas. He thinks everything's about sex and castration, everything. But that being said, whether you buy that idea or not, and I don't buy that idea, I think there's way more complex ideas about why we have rivalries with our mothers as girls and why boys might have rivalries with their fathers or whatever. But Freud was responsible for popularizing this idea of the unconscious. And that is an idea that, you know, even when we're critical of Freud and say like, oh, he's old fashioned, he's like, you know, a weird old guy, he smoked a lot of cocaine, whatever, snorted a lot of cocaine. Did he smoke? My friends and I used to say Freud's on crack, but I just don't think crack existed at the time. Anyway, he did a lot of drugs. And so we're all critical of Freud. That being said, he invented these concepts that by 1954 were just accepted as reality. So Freud was writing around turn of the century. By 1954, all of his ideas had been really popularized. Psychotherapy had been really popularized. Freud becomes this like giant in thought. And these days, most people believe that there is some kind of unconscious thought that we do not have access to, some sort of behavior underneath sort of the surface of our thoughts that we can't just pull up and like figure out about ourselves. That's a Freudian idea. So I think Golding is thinking about this because he's thinking about what's innate in us versus what is conscious. Yeah. You know, look up these ideas. No. Or whether or not he snorted cocaine. Yeah. Okay. All right. So he's got this idea. Here is our psyche, our sort of like identity. It's an iceberg, Freud would say. And there is some stuff above the water that is conscious. This is the stuff that we can actively think about. So it's like your math class this week, maybe even if you have a good sort of like grasp on math, maybe it's your math class this full year, you know, you can bring it up at any time. You have this consciousness of what's going on. These are your memories that you can recall very easily, maybe memories from up to a few years ago. Your conscious thought is like ideas that you can always bring up, you know, it's the stuff you can actually think about. That's why it's conscious. There is kind of like a line here. Maybe we think of this as like the cold water, the real depths of the ocean. Up here is what is called the pre-consciousness. This is the stuff that you could recall with some help. So if you went to therapy and they were like, tell me about your childhood, and it brings up some memory that you hadn't thought about in a really long time, but the therapist can kind of like prod you to bring that up to the surface. That would be like the pre-consciousness. It's like, it's could be brought up to the consciousness. That's why it's pre-consciousness. So this is the stuff that's like, you know, memories from when you were 5. This is maybe like math class from 7th grade that maybe you don't remember all of the details about, but if someone really helped you, you could. And then this is the unconscious. This is the stuff that has been totally repressed, that you can't access anymore. And that would be like, potentially you could maybe access some of this kind of stuff with like hypnosis. But once you get down here, like that's gone forever. So these are like memories before you're 2 years old. You can't access those. Your brain was not capable of those. This is like anything that has been so deeply repressed that there's no getting it back. That's down here. Yeah.
So I looked up a few things, and it said that cocaine was super popular around 1500s to 1800s. So around when it was forced, and it did say that
He smoked it. All right, now we know for sure. Yeah. But it wasn't illegal at the time. Yeah. Repressed means like it was conscious at some point. Maybe something, often it's dealing with trauma, but it doesn't have to be trauma. It was conscious, you thought about it all the time. But because it was painful for you to deal with, or because it was irrelevant for your consciousness, you just pushed it down all the way, not consciously, like you didn't do it on purpose, but you pushed it all the way down so that somewhere down in this psyche, that still exists. That is stuff that still affects you, but you can't remember it at all. That would be repression.
So how do you prove it?
Right? That's the problem with psychology. There's really no way. It's just a theory. Yeah.
one way you could kind of prove it is it's like you have siblings and they remember a moment in like your childhood
Yeah.
that you don't remember, that you were definitely there and like the whole family remembers. Then you kind of
Good point.
prove that it's
Well, there you would just prove that you could forget that. How do you prove that it's still part of your motivation?
That you
Yes,
can't,
that's
that's
the
the theory part. Yeah. Yeah. But like if it's something, so it doesn't have to be something traumatic, right? But if it's something like, you know, all of our parents, I'm going to get crude, but Freud was all obsessed with this idea. So all of our parents at one point changed our diapers. Right? That's on parent day. This is a horrible thing to think about. At some point that process happened, right? We have, and you know, for most of us, we're probably trained around 3. Like we could potentially have memories of that happening, but Freud would say we have repressed those memories. It is not productive for us to think about those memories. And so we've repressed them and we don't think about them anymore. But our parents could say like, oh yeah, I absolutely changed your diapers. And the fact that you like are a functioning adult means that someone did, you know, at some point. It's just deep down there. The idea that it still affects us, that's Freudian. That's, who knows? Yeah, Whitney.
So what if like you have an event that you know happened, but you've like repressed it, like it's in that unconscious area, but it gave you a phobia? Where would that put you?
That's exactly what he would talk about for
'Cause that's what I
repression.
had.
Yeah, that's exactly what he's talking about because he was thinking about phobias and hysteria.
So,
Yeah.
so yeah, good.
Huh?
It's like a lot of those things.
No.
But it is commonly called white coat syndrome, isn't it?
No.
No, that's mine. I'm not afraid of it, but if I get my pulse taken, it suddenly shoots up and they call it white coat syndrome. So it's
Oh,
like,
yeah,
I'll have like
yeah.
114 pulse because I'm like, I want it to be low. Like, I don't want to have a heart monitor or whatever. Yeah, so that's exactly it. He was looking at patients with phobias and with hysteria. It was mostly women because men were not diagnosed with hysteria, even though I'm sure men were hysterical. So he was mostly looking at these women who had like deep fears of something or who had really deep, like horrible anxiety. And he was trying to come up with a theory to explain why they have this anxiety when it seems like for no good reason. And that would be one of them. It's like you've repressed that experience because it's too painful to think about. Yeah, Ash.
So with like suppressed memories, that like, say like you did go to therapy and like you like realized you had a memory that you forgot about because you suppressed it, where would that be?
So if you realize you have a memory, you can like have some what's called metacognition. You can think about what that memory might have been. But if you can start to remember it again, then that was always in your pre-conscious.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you get like a fear from a positive memory and it be like the opposite? 'Cause
I don't know.
I have this weird thing, like my dad says I used to always watch Jaws like over and over again when I was a little kid. And now I'm so terrified of sharks. I'll have like panic attacks over sharks.
But it's like you gave it to yourself because you enjoyed Jaws so much.
I'm
I'm not sure, I guess. I'm not sure. I kind of have that because my big fear is so stupid. I am afraid of large like statues or animatronics. So like the Universal Studios ride, the Jurassic Park ride, where that T-Rex comes down, that is my, like I'm getting like sweaty. That is my worst fear. It terrifies me. And it's like the drop, fine, whatever, who cares? But it's that animatronic or like the Statue of Liberty. Never, I will never go there. Yes. Yeah, the Statue of Liberty freaks me out. But it's kind of from that, it's like I kind of like liked it, that scary feeling. And so I kind of gave it to myself, I think. Yeah. But I don't know that one's yours is repressed because you've never seen you can't remember watching Jaws all the time. Yeah, I guess it could happen then. Yeah.
Okay, so what if you don't remember why you have a fear or like there's no reason to have a fear?
He would say, there's a reason.
Oh,
You gotta go back to far enough and you'd find that reason. Yeah. Okay, so that's his kind of like idea of consciousness, unconsciousness, right? He also says there's 3 parts to your psyche. So there's this part, and this part. All right. Down here, that is the true you, the id. It shouldn't be capitalized. It's just id. Have you heard that term before, id? So the id is your selfish part of you. And Freud says at your core, you are completely selfish. It is all about self-preservation. So this part of you is aggressive.
But is selfish the right word, or is it just survival?
Yeah, that could be a way of saying it. Survival, but it's not always about survival because he would say you're not just aggressive for survival, you're aggressive because it feels good. The id is like anything that you do that feels good. So it's like, this is the part of you that will like act on impulse. So like, if you if you have a sweet tooth, the id wants to eat all of the sugar and the id will not pay attention to that giving you a stomach ache later. The id is just like, give me all the sugar. Big Mouth is not an appropriate show for high school students, but have you ever seen that show, Big Mouth? That monster guy is the id. Anyway, so it's like acting on impulse. It's like taking whatever you want and being aggressive because you like being aggressive, because you like acting out. It's like your monstrous inner self.
They talked about this in Phineas and Ferb when they went to Candace's mind in the episode where she loses Jeremy's bracelet that he gave her, but it's not a bracelet, it's like string here. Anyway, but like, yeah.
In her mind,
In her
though.
mind, there's an id, and it's just this giant monster that like chases them around, and then Buford falls in love with it.
Okay, perfect. So that sounds like the id. Yeah.
does it stand for something or is it just id?
It's just id. Yeah. All right. But the reason that the id doesn't take control is because we also have something called the superego. This is the part of the psyche that is really excited about rules and regulations and morality. This is the part of us that is going to keep us in a group, in a community. And it's the part of us that is going to regulate our behavior, regulates the id. But this is the part of us that is, so this down here, this is like our desire to be regulated. We have both a desire to act out on all of our impulses, but we also have this desire to like cut back on that. So it's like we have, Freud calls this the pleasure principle. We always want to do what, you know, feels good. But then we also have this like, almost like a self-hating desire to like control the id. So it's like rules and regulations, morality. This would be like where church goes. This would be where like rules go. So you think about this in kindergarten. If you are an only child and you show up in kindergarten, your parents have tried really hard, as only children, your parents try really hard to socialize you because that can be difficult for only children, right? But there's only so much they can do through play dates and so on. So a lot of times only children show up in kindergarten and they're insane. They're not like acting out. Only children tend to be introverts, but like they get to school and they don't know how to share properly. They don't know especially how to share attention. So it's like really hard to get them to like raise their hand or whatever. But kindergarten's job is to say, okay, you're part of a society now. You're part of a civilization. So here, we got to teach you how to share. We got to teach you how to raise your hand and not call out, teach you how to keep your hands to yourself, all of that. That would be like this super ego imposing onto the id. And we've got that in a lot of different ways. We've got religion does that. We've got like just the laws of society, like, okay, we're all gonna, you know, drive the speed limit. We're all going to not murder each other. The id wants to murder each other. Like the id is perfectly okay with murder. The super ego is this part of you that says, if you murder people, there will be consequences. So stop murdering people. Yeah.
So, okay, maybe it's just the way that you've drawn your iceberg, but is this like saying that like originally down at the very, very bottom of your id of the iceberg,
Yeah.
then like that is who you were born to be, but then as like time goes on, then like super ego is taught, is that
Kind of
what that's-
added in. Yes, but as time goes on, sounds a little bit like, oh, you learn it when you're older, but it's actually from the moment you enter the world and your parents say, hello, your name is Whitney Borup. We're going to put clothes on you. Already, I've got an imposition on the id, right? So it's like from the very first moments, we also have super ego imposing things onto the id. Yeah. Yes.
So would Freud argue that like with your id, like everyone has this thing that like everyone wants to murder someone
Yeah.
eventually?
Yep. Deep down, everyone wants to murder. Yeah. Yeah.
That iceberg looks like a conch shell.
Oh, it's wonderful. Okay, well, speaking of the conch, this is why we don't murder people. There is also what is called the ego. This is where we get that word ego from. Ego means like, you know, when you say someone has a big ego, it's like they think that they're all important. You know, for Freud, ego was the one that regulates between these two. Id and superego. Sometimes it's appropriate for the superego to take control completely and say like, okay, I don't necessarily agree with these rules, but I'm going to follow them because I know what the consequences are. Sometimes it's appropriate for the id to come forward. You're in a fight, you need to defend yourself, go id, you know. At other points, it seems to be like at most points in our life, it seems to be that we need to regulate between the two of these. We don't want to just let go of selfish desires completely, or that can become a problem for us. You know, it would be like this way of like erasing everything that you want and doing everything for other people in society. That can be an issue. At the same time, if you're doing all id, like you are, first of all, not kind of like there's a desire to be controlled a little bit, right? So you're not giving into that desire, but this is for Freud again. But if you're all id, also you're gonna go to prison. You're a psychopath, right? You have no feelings, you have no regard for other people. So the ego is like, here is the appropriate amount of superego, the appropriate amount of id to kind of let into consciousness to determine behavior. So it's this in-between thing that says like, here is what we are as a person. Here's how much id we give into. Here's how much superego we give into. That's the ego. Okay, Xander, yeah.
Was Freud like a super depressed person?
Yes.
Okay. So then why is there so much stock in a theory that believes all people are inherently bad and it was made up by a dude who did drugs and hated himself?
Because I think through history, we've seen too much evidence of how when people are like down to their like into their base moments, they resort to violence. And so I think we've seen too much evidence of like the rotten qualities of human beings that people have started to accept it more and more.
But why does the theory leave absolutely no room for humans being good?
Well, we are good. This isn't just, it's socially imposed, but we also accept the social imposition. But you're right, like at our core, Freud would say like, terrible.
So our only sense of morality is from other people.
It's outside, yeah, it's not human nature
But
necessarily.
if everybody sucks, then where did the good come from?
Great question. So we've got civilization, right? That actually helps us become good.
But there had to be a first guy, right?
The first civilization, yes. And I think you could say the first guy that paired up with another guy and said, let's be friends, realized that they couldn't be all id. And there's a desire that we have. Part of the id is kind of like contradictory because part of the id is we want to murder each other, but part of the id is that we want to love each other too. So like not selflessly, not altruistically, but part of the id says, I find enjoyment in the company of other people. And the only way to get that is by like repressing the id. The id is a very ironic, contradictory part of us. So civilization offers us first safety. You make a buddy and then you guys can fight the mammoth and, you know, have food and you can fight the saber-toothed tiger and you don't have like danger, you know, so you do it for safety. And the other way is, and this is kind of what I mean by love, civilization offers opportunities for procreation. So if you don't have a civilization, there aren't going to be enough people around to, you know, spread the gene pool. So that even though civilization is this imposition on the id, we still want it. So Freud's idea is, yeah, Xander's right. Freud says like people at their core are terrible, but we also want these two things. And so we give up our happiness. If the id is like what could make us completely happy, we give up our happiness in favor of civilization. It's because we like these things. Ash?
So two things. So based on this like iceberg, hypothetically, does everyone kind of have their own because the ego is like different for everyone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it just depends on the person.
Yep. Yep. Everybody's iceberg looks a little bit different with the lines that divide things.
Okay.
Yeah.
And also like, say that like at like beginning of civilization, did people just like, was there no super ego until like people realized that killing other people was
That's a really good criticism of Freud. And I think part of that comes from because he said having a super ego is part of our unconscious kind of like desires to be controlled. So I think he says like it's a part of us to want to find those controls. So, and I wish I could be more specific about this. I need to go back and read my Freud a little bit more about super ego, but it's like a part of us to want those controls. And so we will impose that kind of automatically when we get into groups, and we'll build up those civilizations. Go ahead.
so would one of them like come first or
It comes first though.
okay,
Yeah.
like so he knows that it came first, like
Yeah. I don't think he has a theory of like the first caveman is like all id. I don't think he had a theory. Freud was writing at the exact same time. He and Darwin were contemporaries. So he wasn't having to deal with evolution at all. So I don't even think Freud was imagining anybody like pre-Romans, you know, he was just thinking about like, let's start there and see what happens from that. Yeah. Whitney?
So is the super ego what keeps like memories you want to repress there to regulate? Like, so if you learned a lesson from something you did and you're super like mad at doing that is, or like something like you did something bad, you want to repress it, but you can't because then you learned from it and you know you can't do it again.
That's ego.
That's
Ego's the one that's in charge of repressing memories or bringing memories forward. Yeah, as a help, as a tool for life regulation. Allison?
I've been watching a lot of Star Wars stuff lately, so literally the only thing I can think of is like super ego are Jedi, it is the Sith, and ego is the whole like, are you done?
Yes, yes, that's absolutely it. That is exactly it. Yeah.
So if ego is the one that like suppresses the memory, then like why would the ego?
Because some stuff that happens down here is a lot of stuff that happens down here is very painful for us, and it will create an identity that is not functional if we are always remembering it. So the ego wants to suppress some of that. Some of it is also just irrelevant to who you are now, and the ego is kind of like decided it's not. We don't need to remember this anymore.
Like this matters and this doesn't, and
Yeah.
if you're in the civilization, then let's suppress these memories.
Yeah, that's it. So Freud also was writing before any sort of like neuroscience, right? So he was writing before we knew that brain synapses could not form before a certain age. So he's trying to explain like why some things are being repressed. Like, why don't we remember when our parents changed our diapers? Well, he says it's because it's really painful to remember that. It's awkward and all of this stuff, right? Now we just know, well, for the most part, it's because these synapses weren't working. But the theory still stands, especially when we're thinking about stuff like trauma.
I have a question about it, and then
Okay.
super ego. But if our super ego like makes it so that we like make civilization
Yeah.
or safety and sex, then like because we want those, right? And those make us like, if we want them, then they would make us happy. So how are we giving up our happiness in favor of happiness? Or do we want something that doesn't make us happy? And why do we want it?
I think, so if I'm answering this right, let me make sure I got it. All right, so it's a trade-off. So he says, this is in his book, Civilization and Its Discontents. Good title. He says, we organize to avoid suffering. So being unsafe, not being able to procreate does cause us suffering, but the id is not logical. The id has many different contradictory wants at once. So it's like we want to avoid suffering, but the way to avoid suffering is ironically inflicting more suffering on ourselves. So he says, and it's like supposed to be a protection from man against nature, but it makes individual satisfaction impossible. So it's like us trying to do, it's like us, we can't have our cake and eating it too. And we would rather these things than murdering. Yeah.
And then
It's a little
would
contradictory.
the id be like almost anarchist?
So that's really interesting to me because I was a teenage anarchist. I was a teenage anarchist. That's gotta be a book if it's not one, right? So anarchy rejects this whole thing. Xander might be more happy with anarchy actually, because anarchy as a political system, just as an idea, I mean, as a political system, it says, no, we are not selfish and awful underneath it all. Underneath it all, we are good. We are altruistic. We love each other. If all of these dumb government systems and all of these like social manipulations got out of our way, we wouldn't feel this need to compete with each other anymore, and we could live in harmony. So anarchists say the id is actually like, at our core, we are great people. It's the super ego who is imposing all these rules on us that make us feel like we're restricted, and that's what causes us to act out. So anarchists say, get rid of all government and we'll have utopia. It's not realistic, but I really like that idea as a teenager because of course you're in school, right? Get rid of all social systems and we will just be perfect. We can do what we want and be happy. So not quite, but if we did get rid of all of this and like, yeah, Does that make sense? The anarchy idea. So this on its own would be more like a world ruled by complete psychopaths. All psychopaths. Just doing everything completely selfishly, no emotional attachment to people. Yeah.
Okay, so say you can't access the unconscious.
Right.
You can only access conscious and pre-conscious. So if you repress something and that like makes you unhappy, how do you be Gandhi? How do you just be okay with it?
So I think Gandhi has this like well-formed super ego that has become his consciousness, and so he can be, maybe he does have things that he can't act out on, and Gandhi kind of famously like abused his wife sometimes. So there are some, there's some darkness in all of us, but there are ways to regulate this to where we are completely happy, or we are not happy, but we are satisfied with the repression of the id. And we are satisfied in the way our ego is regulating between the two. And that's how we become happy. So it's okay that we've got some bits of unhappiness in us, some things we can't act out on, because we can be satisfied with the regulation. Does that make sense? So in therapy, a lot of times in like psychotherapy, and people who do psychotherapy, like Freudian psychotherapy, they have to go to their own special college. So there's like a couple of them, one in New York, and you have to go for like 3 years after your doctorate degree to learn how to do this. And it's like, they're trying to figure out, they'll do a lot of dream psychology. They'll do a lot of like stream of consciousness, and they're trying to pull up stuff from the pre-conscious so that they can explain what happened in the past. And this idea is a little trippy, but I really like this idea. With Freud, because it's repressed, you can rewrite the past with your consciousness. So if this is unconscious and you have this way of, it's been buried, you can kind of bring up the idea that that's been buried, even if you can't access the memory again. And you in the present can look back on that memory and say, I'm going to refigure this. I'm going to figure out a new way to think about this. And because I can't access it, that new way of thinking about it can become reality. And I can just reframe what happened to me and move forward from there. So it's like the past is not set in stone. The past is not solid. You can change the past in Freudian thinking because you don't even have access to the past. So you can change your thinking about it, and that basically changes the past for you. It's a trippy idea. Does that make a little bit of sense?
Yeah, but I'm thinking about more things.
With that idea, you should watch Where the Wild Things Are again, that 2008 movie, because I think it's about Freudian psychology and rearranging the past. Yeah, Abby.
Okay, I found a song called I Was a Teenage Anarchist. It's by a band called Against Me.
Oh, Against Me.
And
All
then
right, good.
I also found a book that's just titled Teenage Anarchist by River Wolf.
I don't know that person. Okay.
Yeah.
But I Was a Teenage Anarchist. That makes sense. It's an Against Me song. Yeah. Yes, you can. Okay, that was a longer discussion of this Freudian psychology than I was expecting. It's interesting stuff. Even if you don't buy it, it's interesting. I will say, I think William Golding buys it. Because if we're looking at this book as allegorical, that means that every bit of it can be part of a symbol, like leading up to a symbol. So like each character could be symbolic, each object can be symbolic, every action can be symbolic. And he's trying to make this point about what we are as people. And I think he buys in to this kind of model of what we are as people. And I think he has different characters representing different parts of the psyche. So in your, with your partners in your small groups, I want you to decide which character in the book represents the ego, the superego, and the id. Just have a conversation about it.
Ego is wrong. Because he wants morality at the same time. But he doesn't. Isn't respect. He also doesn't respect
Simon just like wants somebody. And then at its core, he wants I
And
Yeah.
Yeah. So, then what is that? Two things. Is disrespectful from everyone. What does that mean? But also, how is that? What does that mean for the ego? That at first he disrespects Biggie.
You're like more.
Jack is full of psycho. And then after Jack attacks Rex, then he respects Biggie.
That's a great question.
But like, how would they do that?
So I think the Viking Jack is also part of this thing.
Okay, second question. All of these objects in the book that are symbols, the beast with the parachute, the Lord of the Flies, the conch, the glasses, the fire, all of it has the symbolic sort of significance to it. Where do you think those lie? Like which is the conch representative of ego, superego, or id? Is fire representative of id, superego, or ego? Talk about the symbols in the book too, the symbolic objects.
That's hard.
Like ego.
I actually don't know the reason
I think agreed. I think
And they might not all fit in, but you can think if they do.
And then at the end.
Like interacting.
glasses.
What was so
I think the beast is more symbolic to what can become a beast, what is a beast, and the beast is actually evil at its
And then I think
So-
fire,
So you're saying
like at the beginning, it was ego, but like later on.
Judged by human standard.
Okay, last bit. Here's what's important for if we were to use Lord of the Flies on a major works. All those symbols, we can think about what the symbolic representation is, right? But then we have to figure out what it adds up to. So Xander, I overheard him and Whitney talking and was already kind of doing this, which it was like, okay, if Piggy is the super ego and Jack is the id, right? And you said Ralph is the ego, then what does it say that at the beginning, Ralph rejects Piggy and kind of accepts Jack, but then it switches at the end of the book where Ralph and Jack are enemies and Ralph remembers Piggy as this like wise, loyal friend, you know? So what does that tell us about identity formation, or what does that tell us about human nature? So with those kind of questions, you're thinking about what doing this, like adding this up as like seeing the symbols as representing these different parts of ourselves, you're saying what theme that creates, right? So try and answer that question with your groups. It's going to be really complicated with lots of different avenues, but what do you think this model tells us about what the book is telling us about human nature? Make sense?
I think it's saying that it like in
We can't really
survival outsourcing to regulate your actions. You can have one of these can come out so that an id, your id can become more prominent, like it didn't as strength, whereas Piggy, like it's a super ego that survival.
like in order to be happy,
Is like
accept the super ego
just
as well, as much as we want to just accept it.
Yeah.
So you're saying that in survival
Yeah.
situation, like judgments matter less because when you go back to
No, it's also a structure about which one is more prominent without a civilization. Like everyone has a different one that's like prominent, but society balances it, like you're saying. So society and civilization balance.
What are you saying, Ash?
I was
But
saying that all the
some
people that
have
we've
more
talked about in this class that are like have these like great ideas are either depressed, on drugs, or both.
Yeah, it kind of supports ignorance is bliss, huh? Just accept things. Stop thinking about it so much. It's just gonna depress you.
People that actually know how to be happy.
Yeah, right. The people who know how to be happy are just like just living.
Yeah. People that are
Or like actually
And the rest of us are just like, not us, sorry. The rest of people are just like, how do we live in this world, you know? Give me answers, and even if the answers are kind of depressing. Yeah, Freud is an interesting cat. All right, we gotta move on from this. Next time, we will finish up with our discussion of Lord of the Flies by looking at the interaction between Lord of the Flies and Simon, because we haven't looked at that yet, but we do need to fit in a timed essay here. So we're gonna do this short passage essay. On back. We've been practicing this style. A couple of you have come in and done one of these after school, which is awesome. So this one is from an older text. I'd say it's about half and half. About half the time it's from older, half the time it's from more contemporary. So I thought I'd give you this one to practice because this deals a lot with what we've been talking about in terms of like regulating your impulses. In this case, this passage is definitely about like ideas of being a gentleman or masculinity in the 1700s. So like kind of old fashioned chivalry masculinity. So let's read the prompt together. It says, in the passage below from The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle by Tobias Smollett, Mr. Pickle encounters Godfrey Gauntlet. They have the best names, the brother of his beloved Amelia. So Mr. Pickle and Amelia are a couple, and Mr. Gauntlet, Godfrey Gauntlet, does not like that they're a couple. Basically, he's the brother. Consider how the two men confront their uncontrolled emotions and yet attempt to abide by their social norms. In a well-developed essay, analyze how the author explores the complex interplay between emotions and social propriety in the passage. So it is telling you that your theme should deal with something about regulating emotions in society. You may wish to consider such literary techniques as dialogue, narrative pace, and tone. So they will do this sometimes. They will give you the things that you could focus on in the passage. They're like, hey, notice some of the patterns with the dialogue, the pacing, and the tone. But when you write your thesis, they don't want to see dialogue, narrative, pacing, tone. They don't want to see those exact words. They want to see you getting a little bit more specific with that. So, passive aggressive dialogue, quick narrative pacing, angry tone. And you also do not need to use all three of those. And you don't even need to use any of them if you're thinking that descriptive details and, structure is a little bit more interesting to talk about. They're just giving that to you as a suggestion. The other thing to notice here, you guys are doing great with like your thesis and then breaking that down into your paragraphs. Keep doing that with this essay, like write your thesis, figure out what the paragraphs are going to be, depending on how you like to do that. If you like to do that ahead of time, you can. If you like to do it while you're writing, do that, do whatever works for you. But the thing to keep in mind is that they're looking for direct evidence in the paragraphs. And so always pull out the stuff that's supporting that you saying the pattern is actually there, this theme is actually in the passage. Yes. No, you do not need to say anything because we only have this one passage and so they know where everything is. Yeah, so you don't need to count lines or anything like that. Okay, so you got 40 minutes for this. That'll take us right up to the end of class. Are you ready? Hooray. Okay, ready? Go.